On a warm spring morning in 2004, in the quiet suburbs of Gwinnett County, Georgia, a mother named Marissa Techel woke to find her 7-year-old daughter's bed empty. The window stood open. The screen had been cut from the outside. Little Marissa Techel was gone. For 20 years the family would search. For 20 years they would wait. For 20 years they would wonder if the person who took their daughter had been standing right beside them all along. What happens when the answer you've been seeking is the one you cannot bear to hear? The subdivision called Ashford Park sat nestled in the sprawling expanse of Gwinnett County, just northeast of Atlanta, where cookie-cutter homes lined streets named after English countryside estates. This was Georgia in the early 2000s, a place where the American dream sprawled outward in 2-story colonials with attached garages and HOA-approved mailboxes. Families moved here for the schools, for the safety, for the promise that nothing bad could happen on streets named Pemberton Lane and Cambridge Drive. The Techel family had arrived in Ashford Park in the fall of 2003. Marissa Techel, 32 years old, worked as an administrative assistant at a medical supply company in Norcross. Her husband, Robert Techel, 35, managed inventory at a warehouse distribution center off Highway 316. They had 2 children, Marissa, age 7, with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile, and Jacob, age 4, who followed his sister everywhere with the devotion only younger siblings possess. They were, by all accounts, an ordinary family. They paid their mortgage on time. They attended the occasional block party. Marissa volunteered in Marissa's 2nd-grade classroom every Thursday afternoon. The house on Pemberton Lane was a 3-bedroom rental with beige siding and black shutters. A small magnolia tree grew in the front yard. Robert had hung a tire swing from the oak tree in the back, and on warm evenings you could hear Marissa's laughter carrying across the neighboring yards as she pumped her legs higher and higher toward the darkening sky. The neighborhood was the kind of place where people waved from driveways, and where the sound of lawn mowers on Saturday mornings created a steady suburban symphony. April 14, 2004, began like any other Wednesday. Marissa woke at 6:15 a.m. as she always did. She could hear the birds already active outside, sparrows and mockingbirds announcing the dawn. The temperature hovered around 62 degrees, mild for mid-April, with a light breeze that carried the scent of the neighbor's Confederate jasmine over the fence. Marissa started the coffee maker. She laid out bowls for cereal. She walked down the hallway to wake the children. Jacob's room was first. He slept sprawled across his twin bed, his stuffed elephant clutched under one arm. Marissa touched his shoulder gently and he stirred, rubbing his eyes. Then she moved to Marissa's room, the door partially open as it always was. Marissa was afraid of the dark and insisted on keeping both the hallway light on and her door ajar. Marissa pushed the door wider. The bed was empty, clear as throat. The covers had been pulled back neatly, folded down toward the foot of the bed in a way that seemed almost deliberate. Marissa's stuffed rabbit, the one she'd named Mr. Buttons and slept with every single night since she was 3 years old, sat propped against the pillow. The window, which faced the backyard, stood open. The screen had been cut along 3 sides and bent inward, creating a flap large enough for someone to climb through. A slight breeze moved the curtains. Marissa would later describe that moment as the point where time seemed to stop and accelerate simultaneously. Her heart hammering, her voice calling Marissa's name once, then louder, then screaming it. Robert came running from the master bedroom, still in his boxers and t-shirt. They searched the house together, flinging open closet doors, checking under beds, calling Marissa's name with increasing desperation. The bathroom, the basement, the garage. Jacob stood in the hallway, confused and frightened, asking where Sissy was. At 6:32 a.m., exactly 17 minutes after Marissa discovered the empty bed, Robert dialed 911. The recording of that call would later be played dozens of times. Robert's voice tight with panic. "My daughter is missing. Her window's been cut open. Someone took her. Someone came in and took my little girl." The dispatcher's calm questions. Robert's increasingly frantic responses. In the background, Lisa sobbing, her voice cracking as she said Marissa's name over and over. The first Gwinnett County Sheriff's deputy arrived at 6:41 a.m. Deputy Marcus Chen had been patrolling nearby when the call came through. He would later describe the scene in his incident report. Parents in obvious distress, younger child crying in mother's arms, no signs of forced entry except the cut window screen. He radioed for backup and additional units. Within 20 minutes, Pemberton Lane was filled with patrol cars, their lights painting the morning blue and red. Detective Sarah Winters arrived at 7:05 a.m. She was a 12-year veteran of the department, assigned to the Criminal Investigations Division. She wore dark slacks and a blazer, her badge clipped to her belt. She walked through the house methodically, documenting everything with photographs and notes. The cut screen, the neat bed, the open window. She noted that the window was approximately 4 feet off the ground on the exterior side, easily accessible from the backyard. No footprints were visible in the grass below, but the ground was hard, and it hadn't rained in over a week. Inside Marissa's room, Detective Winters observed several details that would become significant later. A pair of Marissa's sneakers sat by the door, exactly where they always were. Her backpack hung on its hook. Her clothes from the previous day lay in the hamper. A glass of water on the nightstand remained half full. The room showed no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scratches on the windowsill. For those who have ever examined a crime scene, there is a particular kind of absence that speaks louder than evidence. This was one of those scenes. By 7:30 a.m., the search operation had expanded dramatically. Sheriff's deputies canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on every door, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. No one had. The Harrises next door had been asleep. The Johnsons across the street had heard nothing. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived 2 houses down and was known to be a light sleeper, said the night had been perfectly quiet. A K-9 unit arrived at 8:15 a.m. The Bloodhound, an experienced tracking dog named Bear, was given one of Marissa's worn t-shirts to establish scent. The dog tracked from the bedroom window across the backyard to the fence line, then lost the scent at the wooden gate that led to the greenway behind the houses. The greenway was a narrow strip of wooded common area that ran between the backyards and a drainage creek. It was overgrown with kudzu and pine saplings, the kind of place neighborhood kids sometimes played, but parents generally told them to avoid. Bear circled the area twice, then sat down, indicating the trail had gone cold. By mid-morning, the search had grown to include over 40 law enforcement personnel. The Gwinnett County Sheriff's Office, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and FBI agents from the Atlanta field office all converged on Ashford Park. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the Techel house. News vans began arriving around 9 a.m., satellite dishes extending toward the sky like metal flowers. Reporters stood on the sidewalk doing live shots, their voices measured and grave as they described the desperate search for a missing 7-year-old girl. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. By noon, over 200 volunteers had gathered at Ashford Park Elementary School, which served as the search headquarters. They formed into teams of 10, each assigned a grid pattern to cover. They walked through the woods calling Marissa's name. They checked drainage ditches and abandoned buildings. They searched a construction site half a mile away where a new housing development was going up. Someone brought coffee, someone else brought sandwiches. Lisa's sister, who had driven up from Macon, distributed flyers with Marissa's school photo. Dark curls, brown eyes, gap-toothed smile. Last seen wearing purple pajamas with white flowers. Throughout that first day, Robert Techel was everywhere and nowhere. He joined the search teams, his voice hoarse from calling Marissa's name. He spoke to reporters on the front lawn, his face haggard, begging whoever had taken his daughter to please bring her home. He answered questions from investigators, providing details about the family's routine, Marissa's habits, anyone who might have wished them harm. Those who observed him that day described a man barely holding himself together, operating on pure adrenaline and terror. But there were also moments that investigators quietly noted. Small things. Robert seemed particularly focused on the cut window screen, mentioning it repeatedly in conversations. "They cut right through it," he would say. "Can you believe someone would do that? Just cut right through the screen while we were sleeping." Detective Winters made a note of this. People in shock often fixated on strange details, but there was something about the repetition that felt rehearsed. At 1:30 p.m., investigators conducted a formal interview with Robert in the back of a command vehicle parked on Pemberton Lane. The interview was recorded. Robert sat with his hands clasped between his knees, his eyes red-rimmed. He described the morning's events again. He said he and Lisa had gone to bed around 10:30 the previous night. They'd watched television for a bit, then turned off the lights around 11. Both children had been asleep. The house had been locked. He was certain of it because he always checked the doors before bed. It was part of his routine. Detective Winters asked about the window in Marissa's room. Had it been locked? Robert paused. He said he didn't think so. The lock on that window had been broken since they moved in. They'd meant to fix it but hadn't gotten around to it. The window was usually closed, though. He was pretty sure it had been closed when they went to bed. Had Robert heard anything during the night? No, nothing. He was a sound sleeper. What about Lisa? She sometimes woke up. Sometimes checked on the kids, but she hadn't mentioned hearing anything unusual. Detective Winters made more notes. She asked about relationships, about whether anyone had shown unusual interest in Marissa. Robert said no. They kept to themselves mostly. Lisa had some friends from work. He knew guys at the warehouse, but nobody who would do something like this. Nobody. The interview lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, Robert stepped out of the vehicle and immediately resumed searching, joining a group heading toward the drainage creek. Clear's throat as the afternoon stretched into evening. The search continued under portable lights that had been set up throughout the neighborhood. The temperature dropped into the 50s. Volunteers wore jackets and held flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness between trees. Someone had brought in a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment, and it circled overhead, the wop-wop-wop of its rotors a constant presence in the night sky. Inside the house on Pemberton Lane, forensic technicians processed every surface. They dusted for fingerprints. They collected fiber samples. They photographed everything from multiple angles. The cut screen was carefully removed and bagged as evidence. Investigators noted that the cuts were clean, made with a sharp blade, possibly a utility knife or box cutter. The screen had been cut from the outside, the metal mesh bent inward. This detail would be repeated in every official report. But there was something else. Something that investigator Tom Bradford, a 23-year veteran of the GBI, noticed and documented in his notes. The cut screen showed no signs of rust or dirt on the interior edges where someone would have grabbed it to climb through. In his experience, screens that had been bent and handled usually showed some evidence of contact, especially if the perpetrator had been in a hurry. This screen was remarkably clean. Bradford made a note but said nothing. It was too early to draw conclusions. By the second day, the search area had expanded to over 10 square miles. Dive teams checked the creek and nearby retention ponds. Helicopters surveyed from above. Bloodhounds tracked scents that led nowhere. The GBI issued an Amber Alert. Marissa's face appeared on electronic highway signs across Georgia, missing child. Marissa.Techel. Call 911. Lisa barely slept. She remained at the house, surrounded by family and friends who tried to provide comfort. She gave a tearful interview to a local news station, her voice breaking as she begged for Marissa's safe return. "Please," she said, staring directly into the camera. "If you have my baby, please bring her home. She's scared. She needs her mama, please." Robert gave interviews too. He spoke to CNN, to the local ABC affiliate, to a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He was articulate and emotional, describing Marissa's personality, her love of drawing and dance class, how she wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. Those who knew him said Robert was devoted to his children. He coached Jacob's t-ball team. He never missed Marissa's school concerts. He was, by all accounts, a good father, yet deputies whispered quietly among themselves. There was something about Robert's affect that didn't quite fit. The way he could shift from tears to calm within seconds. The way he seemed more interested in the investigation's progress than in actively searching. The way he kept returning to specific details, as if making sure everyone remembered them. Detective Winters increased the frequency of her conversations with him, always casual, always framed as needing his help to understand the timeline. On the third day, Robert's timeline began to show cracks. He had initially stated that he and Lisa went to bed at 10:30 p.m., but Lisa, in a separate interview, said it was closer to 11:30. She remembered because she'd watched the news, and the news didn't start until 11. Robert also mentioned that he'd taken out the trash before bed, but the neighbor, Mr. Harris, said he'd seen Robert taking out the trash around 7 p.m. while it was still light out. When confronted with these discrepancies, Robert became flustered. He said he was stressed, that the days were blurring together, that he couldn't remember exact times anymore. Investigators checked Robert's vehicle, a 2001 Toyota Camry. The odometer showed an additional 63 miles since Robert's last fill-up 3 days before the disappearance. Robert said he'd driven to work and back, which was approximately 14 miles round trip daily. That accounted for 42 miles. Where had the other 21 miles come from? Robert said maybe he'd driven to the store, maybe Home Depot. He couldn't remember exactly. On April 17th, 4 days after Marissa's disappearance, a search dog indicated a hit at a location approximately 12 miles from Pemberton Lane. The location was a rural area in adjacent Barrow County, where old logging roads cut through dense pine forest. The area was known to locals but rarely visited. Investigators cordoned off the site and brought in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment. They found Marissa at 3:47 p.m., buried in a shallow grave beneath a layer of pine needles and red Georgia clay. She was still wearing her purple pajamas with white flowers. Her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, lay beside her. The medical examiner would later determine that she had died from asphyxiation, likely within hours of her disappearance. There were no signs of sexual assault, no defensive wounds, no evidence of prolonged suffering. The news spread through the community like wildfire. Volunteers who had searched for days broke down weeping. Reporters who had maintained professional composure struggled to deliver the update. At the Techel house, Lisa collapsed when detectives delivered the news. Her screams could be heard by neighbors 3 houses away. Robert stood motionless in the driveway, his face blank, saying nothing. At the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered something else. Fibers on Marissa's pajamas matched fibers from the carpet in the Techel family's Toyota Camry. Not just similar fibers, an exact match. The car's trunk liner also showed traces of soil that matched the soil composition at the burial site in Barrow County. There was more. A partial shoe print found near the grave matched work boots that were later found in Robert's garage. Size 11. Same tread pattern. Same wear marks. Detective Winters obtained search warrants. On April 19th, investigators descended on the Techel home with forensic teams. They searched every room, every closet, every drawer. In the garage, they found a box cutter with a fresh blade. Forensic testing would later show that the blade's edge characteristics matched the cutting pattern on Marissa's window screen. They also found a receipt from a convenience store in Barrow County, dated April 13th at 11:43 p.m. The receipt was for cigarettes and a bottle of water. Robert didn't smoke. The Techels rarely used cash. But Robert's name was on a credit card receipt in his wallet from that same store, same time. On April 20th, 1 week after Marissa disappeared, Robert Techel was arrested and charged with murder. The arrest took place at 6:30 a.m., investigators approaching the house with a warrant as Robert emerged for his morning coffee. He asked if he could call his lawyer. His hands remained steady as they cuffed him. Those who witnessed the arrest later described his unusual composure, as if he'd been expecting this moment. The story exploded across regional and national media. How could he? The headline screamed, "Father accused in daughter's death." Nancy Grace devoted an entire episode to the case, her voice rising with indignation as she displayed Marissa's school photo beside Robert's booking photo. The community reeled. Neighbors who had searched alongside Robert now felt betrayed and sick. How had he stood among them, calling his daughter's name, knowing what he'd done? The prosecution's case built rapidly. Phone records showed Robert's cell phone pinging off towers near the burial site around midnight on April 13th. Security footage from the convenience store showed a man matching Robert's description purchasing cigarettes at 11:43 p.m. Soil samples, fiber evidence, the timeline that didn't add up. And most damning, Robert had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on Marissa just 6 weeks before her death. The policy listed Robert as the sole beneficiary, but there were those who doubted. Robert's parents hired a defense attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine Morris who specialized in complex criminal cases. She argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the fiber match could be explained by Marissa having been in the car countless times, that the timeline discrepancies were the result of a traumatized man struggling to remember details under immense stress. She painted Robert as a devoted father caught in a nightmare, the wrong man accused because investigators needed to solve the case quickly. The defense presented character witnesses. Robert's mother testified that her son loved his children more than anything. Coworkers said Robert was reliable and kind, always showing pictures of his kids. A neighbor testified that she'd seen Robert playing with Marissa in the yard just days before she disappeared, their laughter filling the evening air. How could a man who loved his daughter so much be capable of this? But the prosecution had more. During a jailhouse phone call with his mother, recorded as all inmate calls are, Robert made a statement that chilled investigators. His mother had been crying, saying she couldn't believe this was happening. Robert had replied, and his exact words were, "I know, Ma, but at least she's not suffering anymore. At least it was quick. At least it was quick." How would Robert know it had been quick unless he'd been there? The trial began in September 2004, just 5 months after Marissa's death. The courtroom was packed daily with media, onlookers, and Marissa's extended family. Lisa sat in the front row every single day, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. She had filed for divorce from Robert within weeks of his arrest. She never looked at him during the proceedings. The prosecution called Detective Winters, who walked the jury through the timeline of the investigation. She displayed photos of the cut screen, the empty bed, the burial site. She explained how the evidence pointed inexorably to one conclusion. Robert Techel had murdered his daughter, staged an abduction, and hidden her body in a location he knew well from his years growing up in Gwinnett County. They called the medical examiner who testified about the cause of death asphyxiation, manual strangulation. It would have taken several minutes. The jury sat in silence, some looking away, unable to process the image of a father's hands around his daughter's throat. They called forensic experts who explained the fiber analysis, the soil matching, the shoe print evidence. They called the convenience store clerk who had been working that night, who identified Robert from a photo lineup as the man who'd purchased cigarettes at 11:43 p.m. The defense fought back. Catherine Morris argued that Robert had driven to that area earlier in the week, explaining the cell phone data. She suggested the real killer could have had access to Robert's car, planting evidence. She painted investigators as tunnel-visioned, ignoring other possibilities in their rush to blame the father. She reminded the jury that there was no DNA evidence definitively placing Robert at the burial site at the time of death. But there was one piece of evidence the defense couldn't explain away. A week before the trial, Jacob Techel, now 5 years old, had been undergoing therapy for trauma related to his sister's death. During a session, using dolls to act out scenarios, Jacob had recreated the night Marissa disappeared. He showed his therapist how Daddy had carried Sissy out of her room while she was sleeping, how Daddy had put Sissy in the car, how Sissy hadn't woken up. The therapist's testimony was carefully presented. Jacob's statement was considered reliable because it had been spontaneous and unprompted, given in the safe space of therapy rather than under interrogation. The judge allowed it. The jury heard it. There was no sound in the courtroom except someone's stifled sob. On October 14, 2004, exactly 6 months after Marissa's disappearance, the jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned with a verdict: guilty of malice murder, guilty of concealing a death, guilty of evidence tampering. Robert showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Behind him, his mother wailed. Across the aisle, Lisa sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face. The judge sentenced Robert Techel to life in prison without possibility of parole plus 20 years. During the sentencing, the judge spoke directly to Robert. "You took from this community, from this family, and from this world a light that can never be replaced. You betrayed the most fundamental trust that exists, the trust between a parent and child. May you spend every day of your remaining life contemplating the magnitude of what you've done." Robert was led away in shackles. He never looked back at the gallery, never acknowledged Lisa or his son or his parents. He simply walked through the door and was gone. But that was not the end of the story. Clear's throat, the years that followed, were a study in how tragedy reshapes lives. Lisa moved away from Gwinnett County within months of the trial's conclusion. She and Jacob relocated to a small town in North Carolina, where her parents lived, and where nobody knew their names or their history. She changed Jacob's last name to her maiden name, hoping to give him a chance at normalcy. She found work as a receptionist at a dental office. She attended every single one of Jacob's school events. She tried, in whatever ways she could manage, to rebuild. But the weight of what had happened never left. Lisa later told a journalist that there were mornings when she woke up and for just a moment forgot that Marissa was gone. Then reality would crash back in, and she would have to live through the realization all over again. She kept Marissa's room intact for 2 years before finally packing away her daughter's belongings. The stuffed rabbit, Mr. Buttons, which had been returned to Lisa after the trial, sat on her dresser. She couldn't look at it without crying, but she couldn't put it away either. Jacob struggled in ways that were harder to quantify. He had nightmares frequently, waking up screaming about darkness and being lost. In first grade, his teacher called Lisa with concerns that Jacob had drawn a picture during art class that showed a stick figure being buried. When Lisa asked him about it, Jacob said he was drawing about Sissy. He said he sometimes dreamed about her, and in his dreams she was always alone and scared. Lisa enrolled him in trauma therapy, where he attended weekly sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in grief and PTSD. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, there is a particular kind of psychological torment involved. Lisa would later admit that she'd had inklings something was wrong in the months before Marissa's death. Robert had been distant, stressed about money. They'd argued about finances, about the insurance policy Robert had wanted to take out. Lisa had thought it was excessive, but Robert had insisted. "We need to protect our family," he'd said. She'd signed the papers without reading them carefully. Now that decision haunted her. Had she somehow enabled what happened? Could she have prevented it if she'd asked more questions? The marriage had been deteriorating even before Marissa's death, though Lisa hadn't wanted to admit it at the time. Robert had become increasingly controlling, questioning where Lisa went and who she spoke to. He'd check the mileage on her car. He'd go through her phone. She'd chalked it up to stress, to the pressures of raising two young children on tight finances. Now she understood it differently. Now she saw those behaviors through the lens of what he'd been capable of. In 2006, 2 years after Robert's conviction, his defense attorney filed an appeal. Catherine Morris argued that the admission of Jacob's testimony had been prejudicial and should not have been allowed. She claimed the investigation had been flawed, that alternative suspects had not been adequately explored. The Georgia Court of Appeals heard the case in 2007. They upheld the conviction. The evidence, they ruled, was overwhelming. Jacob's testimony had been properly vetted and was admissible. Robert's conviction stood. Robert himself maintained his innocence in letters he wrote from prison. He claimed he was the victim of a rush to judgment, that investigators had ignored evidence pointing to an intruder. He wrote to journalists, to advocacy groups, to anyone who would listen. But his claims were undermined by the physical evidence that tied him to the crime. The fibers, the soil, the timeline, the insurance policy, the convenience store receipt. Each piece individually might have been explained away, but together they formed a picture that was impossible to deny. In 2009, 5 years after Marissa's death, a reporter for a true crime podcast called Gone produced a multi-part series on the case. The series interviewed investigators, family members, and legal experts. Detective Winters, now retired, spoke on the record for the first time about aspects of the investigation that had never been made public. She revealed that Robert had, in fact, confessed to aspects of the crime during an unrecorded conversation with a cellmate at the county jail before trial. The cellmate had testified at trial, but his credibility had been questioned because of his own criminal history. Winters said she'd always believed him, and the physical evidence had borne that out. The podcast also interviewed Lisa, who spoke carefully and with great pain about her experience. She said she lived with guilt every day for not having seen what Robert was capable of. She said she worried constantly about Jacob, about how this trauma would shape his life. She said she would never forgive Robert, not for Marissa's death, and not for the years of lies and manipulation that had preceded it. Her voice on the recording was quiet but firm. This was a woman who had survived something unsurvivable and was still standing. Jacob, by 2009, was 10 years old. He was in therapy still, working through trauma that manifested in anxiety and difficulty forming close relationships. He struggled in school, not academically but socially. Other kids made his life difficult once they found out who he was, whose son he was, what had happened to his sister. Lisa changed schools twice trying to find an environment where Jacob could just be a kid. It was never quite enough. The years continued to pass. 2010, 2015, 2020. Marissa's case became one of those stories that people reference when discussing family annihilators or parents who kill their children. Criminologists studied it. Psychology professors used it as a case study in how perpetrators stage crime scenes. Robert's name appeared in textbooks alongside others who had committed similar crimes, his photograph displayed as an example of familial homicide. But for Lisa and Jacob, it was never academic. It was their life. It was the empty chair at the dinner table. It was the birthday that came and went every year, marking not celebration but loss. Marissa would have been 13 in 2010, 17 in 2014, 21 in 2018. Lisa marked each birthday privately, visiting Marissa's grave in a cemetery in Gwinnett County where her daughter had been laid to rest. The headstone read, Marissa Lynn Techel, beloved daughter and sister, taken too soon. In 2019, 15 years after Robert's conviction, the case received renewed attention when a documentary filmmaker petitioned for access to Robert for an interview. Robert agreed. The resulting documentary, which aired on a streaming platform in 2020, showed Robert, now in his 50s, speaking from prison. He looked older, grayer, the years visible on his face. He still maintained his innocence. He claimed the evidence had been misinterpreted. He said he loved his daughter and would never have harmed her. The documentary interviewed experts who examined his claims forensically. They concluded, unanimously, that Robert was lying. His body language, his linguistic patterns, his inability to express genuine grief, all pointed to deception. One forensic psychologist noted that Robert spoke about Marissa in past tense even before her body had been found, a tell that often indicates guilty knowledge. The documentary also included an interview with Jacob, now 20 years old. His face was obscured, his voice disguised, but his words were clear. He said he remembered fragments of that night, not everything but pieces. He remembered his father's face. He remembered being told to stay in his room. He remembered knowing, in the way children sometimes know things without being told, that something terrible had happened. He said he'd spent his childhood trying to reconcile the father he'd loved with the man who had murdered his sister. He said he'd never managed it. Then came 2024, 20 years after Marissa's death. By this point, the case seemed closed, settled, a matter of historical record. Robert remained in prison. Lisa had built a quiet life in North Carolina. Jacob was 24, working as a graphic designer, still in therapy but managing. The case was taught in criminal justice programs. Articles were written on the anniversary. Marissa's name was remembered, if only as a cautionary tale. But in March of 2024, something unexpected happened. A woman named Jennifer Caldwell came forward with information she said she'd been too afraid to share 20 years earlier. Caldwell had lived in Ashford Park in 2004, though she'd moved away shortly after Marissa's disappearance. She said she'd seen something the night Marissa vanished, something she hadn't told police because she wasn't certain of what she'd witnessed and feared getting involved. Caldwell told investigators, in a recorded statement given to the GBI's Cold Case Unit, that she'd been returning home from a late shift as a nurse around midnight on April 13th, 2004. As she'd driven through the neighborhood, she'd seen a man loading something into the trunk of a car parked on Pemberton Lane. The man had been alone. The streetlight had been out on that section of the street, so she couldn't see clearly, but she'd noted it because it had seemed odd at that hour. She said she'd thought about calling police, but had convinced herself she was overreacting. Later, when she'd learned about Marissa's disappearance and then about Robert's arrest, she'd wondered if what she'd seen had been connected. But by then the trial was over, and she'd told herself it didn't matter anymore. Why come forward now? Caldwell said her own daughter had recently turned 7, the same age Marissa had been. Looking at her daughter, she couldn't stop thinking about Marissa, about that night, about her silence. She said she needed to speak up, even if it was 20 years too late. The GBI reopened aspects of the case to evaluate Caldwell's statement. They conducted a formal investigation to determine if her account was credible and whether it added anything new to the existing record. They verified that Caldwell had indeed lived in Ashford Park in 2004. They confirmed her work schedule at the hospital. They reviewed the original case file to see if her testimony would have made a difference. The conclusion, reached in August 2024, was that Caldwell's account corroborated the existing timeline and evidence against Marissa Techel. Her description of seeing a man loading something into a car at midnight aligned with the prosecution's theory that Robert had removed Marissa's body from the house shortly after midnight and driven to Gwinnett County to bury her. If anything, her testimony strengthened the case against him. Detective Tom Bradford, now 71 and long retired, was contacted for comment. He told reporters that Caldwell's statement didn't surprise him. "There are always witnesses who don't come forward right away," he said. "Fear, uncertainty, not wanting to get involved. It's unfortunate, but it's human nature. In this case, though, we had enough evidence to secure a conviction without her testimony. Her coming forward now simply confirms what we already knew to be true." Lisa was also contacted. She declined extensive interviews but released a brief statement through a victim's advocate. She said she appreciated Caldwell's courage in coming forward, and hoped that anyone else who might have information about any cold case would find the strength to speak up. She said that for her and Jacob, the case had never been cold. It had lived with them every single day for 20 years. She said she hoped Marissa's story would remind people to protect children, to watch for warning signs, to speak up when something feels wrong. Robert Techel was informed of Caldwell's statement. He issued a response through his attorney, reiterating his innocence and claiming that the new testimony changed nothing because he had not been the person Caldwell saw. The statement was largely ignored. 2 decades of maintaining innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence had eroded any credibility he might have once claimed. In October 2024, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed Robert's case as part of a routine evaluation. They denied his petition for clemency. The decision cited the heinous nature of the crime, the betrayal of parental trust, and the lack of genuine remorse shown by the offender. Robert would remain in prison for the remainder of his natural life. The case officially was closed once again. But for those who had lived through it, who had searched those woods calling Marissa's name, who had watched Lisa collapse in grief, who had seen Jacob grow up without his sister, the case would never truly be closed. It would remain a scar, a reminder of what human beings are capable of inflicting on those they claim to love.